I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the empty space under the tree where my name should have been. Christmas morning had always been my favorite time of year, the kind of morning where the house felt alive before the sun was fully up, where the smell of cinnamon rolls drifted from the kitchen and laughter came easy, warm, effortless, like it belonged to everyone in the room. My son Daniel stood by the fireplace handing out gifts, calling names one by one, his voice cheerful, practiced, as if he had done this 100 times before, and maybe he had, just not like this. Emily sat beside him on the couch, her legs crossed neatly, a soft smile on her face as she watched the children tear through wrapping paper, her eyes occasionally flicking toward me with something I couldn't quite name, something polished and careful. Boxes stacked high, ribbons shining under the glow of the Christmas lights, each one tagged, each one claimed, each one opened with delight. Laughter filled the room, bright and loud, wrapping around everyone like a blanket I could no longer feel. I stayed where I was, just off to the side of the tree, close enough to see everything, far enough to not be part of it. I looked under the tree once, then again, moving slightly as if a different angle might reveal something I had missed the first time, as if my name might appear if I just gave it another moment. But there was nothing for me. No box tucked behind another, no envelope slipped beneath the branches, not even a tag that had fallen loose. Just empty space, clean and deliberate, like it had been planned that way. I felt the realization settle quietly, not like a sharp pain but like something colder, something that spread slowly through my chest. Someone laughed loudly behind me, and Daniel called out another name, and the room carried on exactly as it should have, as if nothing was missing at all. I folded my hands together in front of me, steady, composed, the way I had taught myself to be over the years, and I smiled when someone glanced in my direction, because that's what you do in moments like these, you keep the peace, you don't make a scene, you don't ask questions you already know the answer to. I said nothing. And in that silence, I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit before. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message, quiet but unmistakable, written not in words, but in absence. Everyone had a box with their name on it. Everyone except me. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, long enough for the last of the wrapping paper to fall to the floor and the final gift to be opened, long enough for the room to settle into that comfortable hum of satisfaction that comes when everyone believes the moment has been complete. Daniel leaned back against the couch, smiling as he watched his children compare their new toys, his voice relaxed now, lighter, as if his responsibility for the morning had been fulfilled. Emily gathered discarded ribbons into a neat pile beside her, her movements calm and deliberate, like someone who liked things exactly where they were supposed to be. I noticed how naturally she fit into that space, how easily she directed the flow of the room without ever raising her voice. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. I stepped quietly toward the kitchen, carrying an empty mug I did not remember finishing, using it as an excuse to move, to breathe somewhere the air did not feel quite so full. The kitchen was quieter, the sounds of laughter softened by the walls, replaced by the low hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock above the stove. I set the mug down by the sink and rested my hands against the counter, steadying myself, not because I felt like I might fall, but because something inside me had shifted, something small but undeniable. I had spent years believing that these moments still belonged to me in some way, that even as things changed, there was a place I could return to, a role I still held. But standing there, listening to the distant laughter that no longer included me, I realized how carefully that belief had been taken apart, piece by piece, until all that remained was habit. There had been signs, of course. Little things I had brushed aside at the time. Invitations that arrived late or not at all. Decisions made without asking me. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. At first, I told myself it was just life moving forward, that families changed, that children grew up and created their own traditions. But now, those moments rearranged themselves in my mind, no longer isolated, no longer harmless. They formed a pattern, quiet and consistent, leading directly to this morning. I reached for a dish towel and dried my hands slowly, even though they were not wet, giving myself time to think, to see things clearly for what they were instead of what I had hoped they might be. From the living room, I heard Emily laugh again, light and easy, followed by Daniel's voice agreeing with something she said. I did not need to hear the words to understand the tone. I turned slightly, just enough to see the reflection of the room in the dark surface of the microwave door, catching a glimpse of them together, comfortable, aligned, as if they had always been on the same side. I had mistaken silence for peace. I had mistaken distance for independence. And most of all, I had mistaken kindness for inclusion. I picked up the mug again, rinsing it slowly under warm water, watching the steam rise and disappear, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to accept the truth without softening it. This had not happened overnight. It had been built, carefully, patiently, until it no longer needed to be hidden. I dried the mug, placed it back on the counter, and straightened my shoulders, not in defiance, not yet, but in recognition. I understood now. And understanding, I realized, was the first step to something they had not considered at all. I carried the tray of coffee cups back into the living room with the same steady hands I had used for years, careful not to spill, careful not to draw attention, because habits like that do not disappear overnight. The room had shifted into a softer rhythm now, the initial excitement fading into conversations that overlapped gently, people settling into their seats, children on the floor surrounded by new toys, their laughter quieter but still present. Daniel glanced up as I entered, offering a quick smile that did not quite reach his eyes, the kind of smile people give when they believe everything is exactly as it should be. Emily looked up next, her expression warm, almost thoughtful, as if she had just remembered something important. "Oh, Margaret," she said. Lightly, brushing an invisible speck from her sleeve, "I hope you did not mind, we decided to keep things simple this year." Her tone was soft, polished, the words chosen carefully, but there was something underneath them, something that did not need to be said out loud. I set the tray down on the coffee table, placing each cup within reach, moving slowly enough to give myself time, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see how the moment would unfold. "Simple can be nice," I replied, my voice calm, even, exactly as it had always been. Emily nodded, satisfied, as if that response confirmed something for her, as if it closed a door she had already decided I would not walk through. One of the children tugged at Daniel's sleeve, asking him to help assemble a toy, and he leaned forward immediately, his attention shifting without hesitation, without a second thought. I watched him for a moment, noticing how easily he followed the direction of the room, how naturally he fit into the life that had been arranged around him. It was not that he was unkind. It was that he no longer saw what was missing. I picked up a stray piece of wrapping paper from the floor, folding it neatly before placing it in the trash bag by the couch, my movements quiet, almost invisible, the way they had become over time. "Did you see what Santa brought, Grandma?" one of the children asked, holding up a brightly colored box, eyes wide with excitement. I smiled and leaned down slightly to look closer, making sure my expression reflected the joy they deserved, not the absence I had just come to understand. "It looks wonderful," I said, and I meant it, because none of this was their doing. Emily laughed softly from the couch, a sound that seemed to settle easily into the room, and added, "We tried to make it special for the kids this year." The words were simple, harmless on the surface, but they carried a quiet boundary, a line drawn without needing to be explained. I straightened up slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my sweater, and for the first time that morning, I allowed myself to look directly at Emily, not with accusation, not with anger, but with clarity. She met my gaze for a brief second, then looked away, her smile unchanged, her posture relaxed, as if nothing at all had passed between us. But something had. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply understood. I turned back toward the room, toward the people who filled it, and felt the weight of that understanding settle into something steadier, something sharper. They believed this moment had defined my place. They believed I would accept it the way I had accepted everything else. And once again, I said nothing. But this time, my silence was not the same. The rest of the morning moved forward the way it always did, with plates passed around the dining table and familiar recipes filling the air with scents that used to feel like home: roasted ham glazed just right, sweet potatoes with a hint of brown sugar. The same dishes I had made year after year without ever needing to look at a recipe card, because they had lived in my hands for decades. I took my usual place at the end of the table, the one I had always chosen so I could see everyone at once, so I could make sure no one's plate was empty, no one's glass forgotten. But today no one waited for me to begin. No one looked to me for that quiet signal that it was time to start. Instead, Emily spoke first, her voice warm and welcoming as she thanked everyone for coming, as if this had always been her role, as if it had naturally shifted without question. Daniel nodded along beside her, adding a few words of his own, and the others followed easily, their attention anchored where hers was. I folded my hands lightly in my lap, listening, observing, noticing how smoothly the moment unfolded without me, how no one hesitated, how no one seemed to sense anything missing at all. There had been a time when this table felt different, when Daniel would glance at me before speaking, when holidays carried a rhythm that we had built together, one small tradition layered carefully over another until they formed something steady and reliable. I could still remember the sound of his voice as a boy, asking where to sit, waiting for me to serve the first slice, trusting that I would make everything feel right. Back then, the house had felt full in a different way, not just with people, but with a kind of connection that did not need to be explained. I had spent years preserving that feeling, making sure each detail was in place, each moment carried the same warmth as the one before it, believing that consistency was another form of care. But somewhere along the way, that role had shifted without announcement, handed over not in a single moment, but in a series of small adjustments that seemed harmless at the time. Emily suggesting a new recipe here, a different seating arrangement there, a new way of doing things that I had accepted with a smile because I believed there was room for both the old and the new. I had not realized that each of those changes was not an addition, but a replacement. I lifted my fork and took a small bite, the flavors familiar, comforting, and yet something about them felt distant now, as if they belonged to a version of this table that no longer existed. Across from me, Emily laughed at something one of the guests said, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, a gesture that seemed effortless, practiced, as if it had always been there. Daniel leaned toward her slightly, listening, engaged, his focus steady and complete. I watched them for a moment, not with resentment, but with a kind of clarity that had not been there before, seeing not just what was happening, but how long it had been happening. This morning had not created anything new. It had simply revealed what had already been decided. I set my fork down carefully, aligning it beside my plate, and looked around the table once more, taking in each face, each voice, each detail, and for the first time, I allowed myself to stop trying to fit back into something that had already moved on without me. The realization did not break me. It steadied me. Because now that I could see it clearly, I could also see something else, something they had not accounted for at all. They believed this was the end of my place here. They had no idea it was only the beginning of something they would never be able to control. After lunch, the house grew quieter in that familiar way, the kind of quiet that settles in after a holiday meal when conversations break into smaller pieces and people drift into different rooms, carrying their comfort with them. I moved back into the living room slowly, gathering a few empty cups and straightening the cushions that had shifted out of place, small tasks that gave my hands something to do while my mind continued to trace the pattern that had finally come into focus. It was easier to see now, not because anything new had happened, but because I was no longer looking for excuses to soften what I saw. Emily stood near the window speaking with one of the guests, her voice low but clear enough for certain words to carry, words like space, future, and plans. She spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. I did not need to hear every detail to understand the direction of the conversation. It matched too closely with moments I had dismissed before, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, documents left briefly on the counter before being folded away, the subtle shift in tone whenever the subject of the house came up. This house. The one Daniel had grown up in. The one his father and I had spent 30 years paying off, repairing, shaping into something that held more than just furniture and walls. I had always thought of it as something we built together, something that would remain steady no matter how life changed around it. But now I saw how that assumption had made it easy for others to begin treating it differently, not as something shared, but as something waiting to be claimed. I picked up a small decorative ornament that had fallen from the side table and placed it back carefully, my fingers lingering on its surface for just a moment longer than necessary. Daniel walked past me then, his phone in his hand, his attention divided, offering a quick, distracted "everything okay, Mom," without slowing his pace. I turned slightly toward him, meeting his glance with a calm expression. "Everything is fine," I said, and in that moment, I realized how true that statement had become, just not in the way he believed. He nodded once, relieved perhaps by the simplicity of my answer, and continued on without another thought. I watched him go, noticing how easily reassurance could be accepted when it required no effort to understand. From across the room, Emily's eyes met mine again. Briefly, her smile still in place, but there was something sharper behind it now, something assessing, as if she were measuring whether the morning had gone exactly as intended. I held her gaze for a second longer than before, not long enough to create a scene, but long enough to let her see that I was no longer looking past what was happening. Then I turned away, picking up another cup, another small piece of order restored, while inside, something far more important had already begun to shift. I had spent years maintaining this home, this family, this sense of continuity that I believed would carry us all forward together. But continuity, I understood now, can be mistaken for permission. And permission, once assumed, is rarely questioned. I set the last cup down in the kitchen sink and let the water run for a moment, the sound steady, grounding, giving me space to think without interruption. They believed they were preparing for a future that no longer included me. They believed they had already begun to shape it, quietly, carefully, without resistance. I dried my hands slowly and looked out toward the living room again, toward the life that had continued without me even while I was still standing inside it. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider something I had not needed to consider before. If they were making plans for what came next, then so was I. The difference was, they had been speaking about theirs out loud. Mine would remain exactly where they had placed me all morning, quiet, unnoticed, and completely underestimated. The afternoon stretched out in a way that felt both familiar and distant, the kind of slow unfolding that used to bring a quiet comfort, but now only gave me more time to notice what I had missed before. I stepped outside onto the back porch, closing the door gently behind me, letting the colder air settle around me like something honest, something that did not pretend to be warmer than it was. The yard looked the same as it always had in winter, bare branches reaching up against a pale sky, the old wooden fence standing steady along the edge of the property, every inch of it paid for, repaired, and repainted over the years with hands that had never imagined being pushed to the side of what they built. I rested one hand lightly on the railing, feeling the familiar grain beneath my fingers, and allowed my thoughts to settle into something clearer, something more structured than the quiet realization that had been forming all day. For a long time, I had believed that patience was the same as strength, that allowing things to pass without confrontation meant I was preserving something valuable, keeping the peace, holding the family together in ways that did not need recognition. But standing there, with the sound of distant laughter muted behind the closed door, I understood that patience, when misunderstood, becomes permission. And permission, once granted, is rarely returned. I thought back to the small details that had never seemed important enough to question, the way Emily had gradually taken over decisions about the house, the finances, even the schedule of family gatherings, always presented as helpful, always framed as making things easier for everyone. I had accepted those changes because I believed they came from a place of care, because I trusted that intentions mattered more than outcomes. But intentions, I realized now, are often the easiest thing to disguise. The truth is revealed in patterns, in consistency, in the quiet repetition of choices that all point in the same direction. A voice called faintly from inside, one of the children asking where something had been placed, followed by Emily answering immediately, confidently, as if she had always known exactly where everything belonged. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape, but to see more clearly, to trace the shape of what had been happening without interruption. This house, this space, this life, it had not been taken from me in a single moment. It had been redefined around me, until my presence was no longer necessary for it to function. And yet, there was something they had overlooked, something they had assumed without ever confirming. Ownership is not always visible in the way people expect. It does not always announce itself in conversation or decision-making. Sometimes it sits quietly beneath everything, unchanged, waiting for the moment it is finally acknowledged. I opened my eyes again and looked out across the yard, letting the stillness settle into something steady inside me. I had spent years believing that my role here was to maintain what already existed. But roles can change, especially when the foundation beneath them is no longer respected. I turned back toward the house, my hand resting briefly on the door handle before I opened it again, stepping back into the warmth, into the voices, into the life that had continued without me. Nothing on the surface had changed. The same laughter, the same conversations, the same easy rhythm filled the room. But something within me had shifted completely. I no longer needed to wonder what they were doing or why. I understood it now. And more importantly, I understood what needed to happen next. Not today. Not in this moment. But soon enough that when it did, it would not require explanation, because by then, everything would already be exactly where it belonged.